He didn't steal money in the dark. He didn't threaten anyone. He didn't even lie. Yet by sunset, 27 American families had lost everything they spent a lifetime saving. What police later discovered was not a robbery, but trust used as a legal weapon. In broad daylight. Please watch full story. The community center in Dayton, Ohio, opened its doors at 9 in the morning. Sunlight poured through wide glass windows, lighting up rows of folding chairs arranged carefully by volunteers who arrived early. Coffee brewed quietly in the corner. The room smelled faintly of paper, old books, and fresh pastries brought by retirees who liked to contribute something small to every event. Most of the people inside were over 60. They came early, not because they were excited, but because routine mattered to them. Retired factory workers, former teachers, widows, veterans, people who had learned over decades that showing up on time avoided trouble later. They trusted schedules. They trusted forms. They trusted places like this. At exactly 10:03 a.m., Daniel Harper walked in. He didn't announce himself loudly. He didn't rush. He paused just long enough at the entrance to let his eyes scan the room, as if making sure everyone was comfortable. He wore a light gray suit, clean but not expensive, pressed but not flashy. His shoes were polished but not new. The kind of man who looked responsible without looking rich. He smiled politely. "Good morning," he said, his voice calm and even. "Thank you for coming." Daniel introduced himself as a certified financial advisor specializing in retirement protection. He didn't start with charts or numbers. He started with stories. Stories about inflation quietly eating away at savings, about unexpected medical bills, about people who worked their entire lives only to find that one bad year erased everything. He never used fear aggressively. He used concern gently. "I'm not here to sell you dreams," he said, resting both hands lightly on the table in front of him. "I'm here to help protect what you already earned." People nodded. They liked that sentence. He showed credentials. Real ones. His name appeared in state records. His company existed. The documents were clean. Volunteers glanced at each other and relaxed. Everything felt normal. Safe. Legal. Daniel spoke for just under an hour. He didn't overload anyone with information. He avoided technical jargon. He spoke slowly, repeating key ideas, making sure no one felt lost. By the time he finished, people weren't excited. They were reassured. At noon, he invited anyone interested to speak with him privately. One by one, people sat across from him at a folding table near the window. Sunlight fell across stacks of neatly arranged documents. Daniel never rushed. He listened, asked about pensions, about spouses, about health concerns. He remembered names. He didn't ask for cash. He didn't ask for bank cards. He didn't ask for passwords. He asked them to sign forms, authorization forms, temporary management permissions, short-term restructuring agreements, pages filled with professional language, printed clearly, clipped neatly together. He explained each page calmly. He pointed where signatures were required. He answered questions patiently. Most people skimmed. They trusted the tone, the setting, the fact that it was broad daylight in a public place with other people around. By 3:40 p.m., Daniel Harper closed his briefcase. He shook hands. He smiled. He thanked everyone for their time. By evening, money began to move. Not stolen. Transferred. Savings accounts shifted. Retirement funds redirected. Emergency reserves emptied. Everything approved. Everything legal. The next morning, phone lines at local banks lit up. Confusion turned into panic. Then disbelief. Then silence. Police were contacted, but there was nothing obvious to chase. No forced entry. No forged signatures. No fake identities. Daniel Harper had done everything with consent. The first real crack didn't come from a detective. It came from Margaret Lewis. Margaret was 72, a retired librarian. Careful, organized, methodical. When her bank statement showed her account nearly empty, she didn't scream. She didn't cry. She went to the bank. "I want to see the document I signed," she said quietly. The clerk printed it. Margaret sat down and read every line. Then she frowned. There was a single sentence she didn't remember seeing. One line that granted full discretionary control over her account for 24 hours. Margaret tapped the paper lightly. "I underline important sentences," she said. "This one isn't underlined." Police reviewed the community center footage. They slowed it down. They watched Daniel explain the paperwork again and again. Then they noticed something no one had seen before. Every time he reached the final page, he adjusted the document slightly. Not enough to hide it, not enough to block it, just enough for the overhead light to cast a shadow across that sentence. He never lied. He never covered the page. He let light do the work. And that was when investigators realized this was not a mistake. It was a method. The investigation didn't explode overnight. It unfolded quietly, the same way Daniel Harper's crime had. At first, law enforcement treated the reports as isolated financial disputes. Different banks, different customers, different paperwork. Nothing that screamed criminal intent. Everything looked like bad decisions made by adults who had signed documents willingly. But when Margaret Lewis's complaint reached a federal investigator named Thomas Reed, something changed. Reed had spent nearly 20 years working financial fraud cases. He knew one thing better than most officers. When victims describe the same emotional experience, even if the paperwork differs, there's usually a pattern hiding underneath. Margaret didn't say she was tricked. She didn't say she was rushed. She said something more disturbing. "He made me feel safe." Reed requested the footage from the Dayton Community Center. He watched it without sound the first time, just focusing on body language. The calm movements, the deliberate pauses, the way Daniel leaned back slightly whenever someone hesitated, giving the illusion of space and control. Then Reed watched it again with sound. Daniel never once promised profit, never exaggerated returns, never pressured anyone. Everything he said was technically true. Reed pulled reports from nearby counties, then nearby states. The similarities were subtle but unmistakable. Same type of venue, same age group, same structured documents, same 24-hour window of financial movement. Daniel Harper wasn't improvising. He was repeating. Federal subpoenas followed. Bank records were requested. Travel histories were compiled. Hotel receipts painted a map across the Midwest and Northeast. Ohio, Pennsylvania, Indiana, Michigan, Illinois, always daytime, always public buildings, always one visit per location. He stayed in each city less than 12 hours. Morning presentation, midday meetings, evening departure, no returns, no follow-ups. It was as if he understood something most criminals didn't. Questions come later. Trust comes first. When agents obtained Daniel's laptop, they expected encryption, hidden folders, or deleted files. Instead, they found order. Every city had its own folder. Every folder contained the same templates, same font, same spacing, same structure. The only variation was state-specific legal language. Daniel had studied regulation differences carefully. He targeted jurisdictions where short-term discretionary control was legal under broad consent. He exploited complexity, not ignorance. Investigators brought in psychologists. One expert explained how seniors process information differently, especially in formal environments. Public spaces increase perceived legitimacy. Daylight reduces suspicion. Professional attire triggers compliance. Daniel hadn't preyed on weakness. He'd preyed on normal human trust. Meanwhile, Daniel Harper continued living his life. He didn't flee. He didn't hide. He didn't change his name. He checked into hotels using his real identification. He ate at diners. He attended networking events. He even scheduled future presentations. When federal agents arrested him at noon outside a conference building in Indiana, he looked genuinely surprised. "Is there a mistake?" he asked calmly. There was no resistance. No dramatic moment. Just paperwork. The trial preparations took months. Victims were interviewed one by one. Some cried. Some spoke angrily. Some spoke softly, embarrassed by how easily it had happened. One man said, "I worked 40 years. He took 40 minutes. Prosecutors debated strategy. They couldn't argue theft in the traditional sense. They couldn't argue force. They couldn't argue deception through false statements. They had to argue something more difficult, intent through concealment. Court sessions began on a bright spring morning. Daniel Harper sat quietly at the defense table. He wore the same style of suit he always did. Neutral colors, conservative tie, clean haircut. He took notes. He listened. He never reacted emotionally. When prosecutors played footage from the community center, Daniel watched without expression. When Margaret Lewis took the stand, he nodded slightly, as if acknowledging her presence. Margaret spoke carefully. "I didn't feel tricked," she said. "I felt guided." The courtroom grew quiet. She explained how she always underlined important sentences, how she always double-checked documents, how nothing about that day felt unusual. "If he had rushed me," she said, "I would have stopped him. If he had raised his voice, I would have asked questions. But he didn't." The prosecution then presented the slowed-down footage, frame by frame. They highlighted how Daniel shifted the papers, how the lighting changed, how that single sentence disappeared into shadow. Expert witnesses explained how subtle visual obstruction affects attention, especially under trust-based communication. Daniel's attorney argued legality. All documents were visible, he said. All signatures were voluntary. The judge listened carefully, then asked one question. If the sentence was so important, the judge asked, why was it always placed where it was hardest to see? Daniel Harper looked down for the first time. Not long, just enough. Outside the courtroom, reporters finally began to gather. The story wasn't flashy. No blood, no violence, no chase. But it scared people, because it looked familiar. People recognized Daniel Harper. He looked like someone they would trust, and that made the case dangerous. The final phase of the trial didn't arrive with drama. It arrived with fatigue. By the time closing arguments began, the courtroom felt different, not tense, heavy. Weeks of testimony had drained the room. Victims had told their stories. Experts had dissected documents. Lawyers had argued intent, consent legality, and ethics. There were no surprises left, only consequences. Daniel Harper sat exactly where he had sat every day. Same posture, same controlled expression. If anyone had expected him to break, they were disappointed. He didn't. The prosecution stood and spoke slowly. They didn't describe Daniel as a monster. They didn't call him greedy. They didn't appeal to anger. They told the jury something simpler. This case isn't about money, the prosecutor said. It's about how trust can be engineered. They walked through the timeline again. Morning presentations, afternoon signatures, evening transfers. They explained how the 24-hour window wasn't random. It was calculated. How the shadowed sentence wasn't accidental. It was consistent. This defendant didn't lie, the prosecutor said. He didn't need to. He understood that when people feel safe, they stop looking. The defense stood next. They emphasized legality. They emphasized responsibility. They reminded the jury that every victim had signed willingly, that adults must be accountable for their decisions. Daniel Harper's attorney finished with one sentence. Being clever is not a crime. The jury deliberated for 2 days. During that time, victims waited in hallways. Some spoke quietly to one another for the first time. They shared stories they had been too ashamed to tell before, about how they felt foolish, about how they hadn't told their families right away, about how trust, once broken, doesn't come back easily. Margaret Lewis sat alone most of the time. She read a book. When someone asked how she was holding up, she said, "I just wanted to end." When the jury returned, the room stood. The verdict was read slowly. Guilty. On multiple counts of financial fraud, through deliberate concealment. There was no gasp, no cheers, just exhalation. Daniel Harper closed his eyes briefly. At sentencing, the judge spoke longer than expected. He didn't lecture. He explained. He said that the law exists not only to punish lies, but to protect fairness. That consent obtained through manipulation is not consent at all. That exploiting trust, especially among those who rely on stability, is not clever. It is destructive. Daniel Harper was sentenced to a lengthy term in federal prison. Heavy fines were imposed. His assets were seized. But the money wasn't coming back. It had been broken apart, moved through legal channels, dissolved into complexity before alarms could ring. For many victims, recovery meant adjustment. Some sold homes. Some postponed retirement. Some moved in with family. A few never fully recovered, not financially, not emotionally. One man told investigators, "He didn't just take my savings. He made me question my judgment." Banks responded quietly. New policies were introduced. Waiting periods for senior account transfers. Mandatory third-party reviews. Clearer disclosure requirements. Community centers changed rules. External advisors required oversight. Presentations recorded. Documents reviewed line by line. Daniel Harper's case became part of training manuals, not as a warning about fraudsters in the dark, but as a lesson about crime in daylight. Years later, a federal investigator closed the final file. He paused before shelving it and said something that stayed with everyone in the room. Criminals don't always hide in shadows. Some stand in the light, because that's where trust lives. Daniel Harper never robbed anyone at night. He never used fear. He never forced a signature. He used daylight. He used routine. He used trust. And that made him more dangerous than most people ever expected.